Well, good morning and welcome to Elevenses. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training, and this is my live webcast. It's show number 180. It's Sunday the 17th of October. It's a bit of a grey, dull day here in London at the moment. Not particularly warm, but there is promise for a bit of sunshine later. And there's a couple of warm days coming as well. So if you want to get 2 days biking in before winter arrives, I think probably Monday and Tuesday are going to be the days for you. Anyway, what have we got for you in today's webcast? Well, first of all, the UK's National Motorcycle Council, the newly formed umbrella body representing rider groups in the UK, has called for changes to rider training. Drivers and riders who pass a red X on motorways now face fines and penalty points. Wire rope barriers are to be replaced in Northern Ireland. Hot on the heels of Kawasaki's announcement of the fact they're going all electric by 2035, they've shown off a hybrid motorcycle. We'll also ask whether the National Motorcycle Council's changes would actually result in the safer biking that they say it should. And before finishing up with today's better biking tip, which is how to stay warm by heating the core of your body and not just your fingers. So settle yourself down with a brew for the next 30 odd minutes. Right, okay, so earlier this week, the National Motorcyclists Council, the NMC, said it was time to make changes to the UK's motorcycle licence testing and training regime. Now, the paper outlines the EU's driving licence directives and explains how they resulted in the current tiered system that we have of bike training, and how that came about directly from the adoption of the third driving licence directive, which came in 2011. It was actually proposed some 5 years before that, so there's plenty of time to talk about it, but it actually was imposed in 2011. Now, one of the functions of the third driving licence directive, and this was something that the NMC's paper didn't really address, was that there was some good reasons for actually introducing that piece of EU legislation. And one reason was to actually introduce a single driving license model, which would work right across the EU and would replace no less than 110 existing different types of license. So on top of that, it would harmonise validity periods. So in other words, when licenses ran out and needed to be renewed, it harmonised vehicle categories right across the EU. And most importantly, possibly of the lot, it set minimum requirements for driving examiners too. So all that was intended to make things easier for licence holders within the EU, particularly those moving from country to country, and also for the national administrations who were issuing the licences. It would also establish a EU network for the exchange of driving licence information, which would make that exchange easier, but also gives the police an easier time for actually checking licences for validity. Now, of course, the bit we're interested in is that for motorcyclists, it introduced the extra tier of what's known as progressive access to motorcycles, and that was based on riders' age and the bike's power. And this is what the NMC paper takes aim at. Now, their position is simple enough. They argue that training and testing should make motorcycling safer. And their position paper states that their analysis of the data indicates that the changes that occurred under that third driving licence directive, which we've now had going, affecting us for 10 years, has actually failed to make motorcycling safe. And they say in 7 statistical measures in the area of headline casualty numbers and casualty rates per mile travelled, the majority of those measures, they have failed to demonstrate an improvement in safer motorcycling. Right, so now, one thing that I had noted some years back, and it's something I've been talking about in my crash course talks, ones I've been delivering at Brands Hatch until 2020. I delivered them for about 6 or 7 years down there. The number of riders killed or seriously injured in the UK has actually been rising since 2011, and that's on the back of several decades of a falling rate of KSIs per kilometre travelled. So there are questions to be asked about the document. So the paper then goes on to propose a series of changes to rider testing and training, and I'll come back to that in a later point in the show when I ask if their proposals actually would result in safer biking. So that's in the news, and we'll discuss whether it worked or not, what their suggestions are later on. Okay, don't forget you are watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams here. If you have comments, questions, feedback, anything you'd like me to cover in a next show or two, and actually I got some suggestions just the other day, which I will get back to. I haven't forgotten those, Denny. I will come back to you on that. Do drop me a line. Let me know what you think, and I will try to fit in a response during the show. So James has looked in and says, unusually he's catching me live. Clive's looked in and said hello. Paul has thanked me. Congratulations for 180. Good point. I hadn't seen that one there, Paul. Nice one. Okay. So what else has been going on in the news? Well, we've been a little bit short of news actually this week, but one important piece of news that you should be aware of is that the DVLA have announced major changes in how motorway lane closures will be policed by camera. Highways England has actually confirmed that automatic cameras on the motorways can now catch people driving in those closed lanes. So now it's been illegal for many years to drive in lanes marked with a red X. I can't quite remember when that particular legislation came in, but it was quite a long time ago. But under new legislation, there is actually a £100 fine and 3 points on the licence if you are caught by camera committing that offence. My observations on that, well, it never takes long to roll out a change that penalises drivers. Yes, it is illegal to use these lanes, and yes, people shouldn't use them, and yes, if people deliberately flout the rules, then I don't see any problem with hitting them with a fine and points on the license. But will it make these motorways, particularly the motorways where there is no hard shoulder and so broken down vehicles are stopped on a live lane, will it actually make it safer to use these this camera technology to actually fine drivers for driving down the lane with the red X? Well, the answer is almost certainly not. The simple truth is that there are many stretches of smart motorway that still rely on operators in control rooms to monitor the cameras visually to detect a stopped vehicle. And then they have to manually implement the road closure by turning on the red X on the gantry signs. And right now it takes far too long. If I remember correctly, the report that was done into these smart motorways a year or so ago suggested it takes minutes rather than seconds for these control rooms to actually detect stopped vehicles. And that's minutes when the occupants of those vehicles are essentially unprotected because other vehicles are not alerted to their presence. In fact, by the time the red X is up, if you think about it, the vast majority of drivers do actually move out of those lanes. And so the people who are flouting the rules by driving down empty lanes, so they can almost certainly see the obstruction. The problem arises when the lane is still open to traffic and there's a stationary vehicle and you can't see it, there's a vehicle ahead. So anyway, smart motorways will be retrofitted with automatic vehicle detection systems, but the time frame for that happening is years. So in my opinion, until we can guarantee that lane closures happen within seconds rather than within minutes, the smart motorways will remain unsafe regardless of how many drivers actually get nailed for driving down a closed lane. Another safety system that's been under fire for even longer are the wire rope barriers that line some roads. Now, they were introduced to replace the steel Armco style barriers along highways and some other major roads. You may wonder why the steel barriers need replacing. Certainly one web author that I was looking at the other day who was commenting on the story didn't seem to realize that there's actually a significant difference in the way they perform. The answer is this: the Armco barriers tend to bounce the vehicles that hit them back into the traffic stream. Now, wire rope barriers actually work very differently. They actually stretch and deform. And so, what they tend to do is guide the vehicle along the wire rope whilst actually slowing it down and bring it to a halt. So, they bring it to a halt alongside the barrier rather than firing it back into a traffic stream. So, the answer is that there's actually less chance of a vehicle pile up. Where other vehicles hit the bouncing back vehicle that's out of control. And when it comes from impacts from heavy trucks, they also work a lot better to restrain the vehicle than a standard steel barrier, where the truck can actually tip over the top or leap it actually. So anyway, not surprisingly, the motorcycling community took one look at these wire ropes alongside roads. I did it myself, I have to say, and they were labelled bacon slicers. So as that writer said, it doesn't take a genius to realise that a steel cable, when impacted at speed by an unprotected human body, is more like a saw blade with catastrophic results. Now, that's a fairly horrific vision, and the Motorcycle Action Group in the UK has been lobbying to have cable barriers replaced and recognised as a genuine hazard for motorcyclists for some time. But I have to say, I haven't actually seen any fact-based evidence to suggest that wire rope barriers actually do put riders at added risk over conventional barriers. I mean, intuitively, it would seem obvious, but the biggest problem, it seems to be any barrier that is on the outside of a corner. And what does seem to be generally accepted in crash studies is that it's the posts that do the supporting, and they support both the wires and the steel Armco barriers, and they are the big issue. And they are a real problem for riders who are already sliding at an angle to that barrier, because hitting those posts does not end well for the rider. So one solution is to cover up the posts with an underrun barrier, and that is specifically to protect fallen riders. Basically, the riders actually then bounce off the underrun barrier, and some barriers do already have that protection. Now, as long ago as the early 2000s, there was actually an EU proposal that all barriers on the outside of bends should have motorcycle-friendly foam blocks fitted around the vertical posts. And new stretches of barrier under that proposal would have had them fitted during installation, which would have been at minimal expense. And existing barriers could have been retrofitted. And again, although it would have involved a road closure and a team going out to do it after the event, it wouldn't have been too expensive. The UK, sadly, was one of the countries that voted against the measure, which was actually narrowly defeated. Now, the only study that I'm aware of on the impact of rope barriers on motorcyclists was actually from New Zealand. And that found that it reduced the number of crossover collisions on a busy stretch of road. And that was the cause of fatal accidents involving motorcyclists. It was when vehicles coming the other way crossed the median and hit a biker on the rider's side of the road. So it wasn't the rider impacting the barrier that was the problem, it was actually other vehicles impacting the rider. So from this perspective, of course, the barrier was on the inside of the corner from the rider's perspective. So really, you'd be very hard pressed to hit a barrier on the inside of a corner. You kind of can see scenarios in which it could happen, but it seems a bit more unlikely to hit one on the outside of the corner. Anyway, it seems that in Northern Ireland, at least, the rider pressure has paid off, and the devolved government out there has decided to act to remove all cable barriers and replace them with conventional steel ones. Now, it won't happen immediately. It'll be implemented either as cables are damaged or become due for replacement, and they will be replaced by steel barriers that have a life of 50 years or more. Speaking of the rule change, MAG's Northern Ireland representative Martin Boyd said, "We know we won't see wire rope barriers being ripped out wholesale and replaced immediately, but it's still great news for rider safety in the long term, and I'm confident that I achieved the best realistic result possible. I'm very pleased to have achieved such a positive outcome for motorcyclists regarding this issue." Well, all I can say to that is I hope that the barriers that do go in to replace the wire ropes are fitted with underrun protection from the off, or we may not see the benefits being hoped for. Right, so okay, don't forget, this show goes out on Wednesdays and Sundays at 11. Almost always goes out live. Very occasionally, I have to put a recording up. If you want to catch it, you can obviously tune in here on Facebook, or you can head over and get the recording here or later on YouTube. I usually put it up a few minutes after the event, or even on my coffee page. There's a link over there to it. Right. Okay. So next show will be obviously on Wednesday. Right. So what else is in the news? Well, hybrid vehicles, cars with an internal combustion engine and an electric power have become a fairly common sight on the road, and they definitely come with some pluses. Obviously the internal combustion engine is there for longer journeys and is easily refueled, but the electric motor can be used for short journeys. So I borrowed my brother's Audi out in California a couple of years ago, and actually did a 1,000-mile round trip in it, and that took in the worst of the Los Angeles traffic snarl-ups. It's cope with busy freeways and empty rural roads, flat desert, mountain roads as well. And it's that sort of hybrid where the petrol engine can be used for normal driving, but also to recharge the battery as you're on the move. Now, I have to say the car was very responsive, both in petrol and electric modes. And by exploiting the electric motor in urban traffic, and then using regenerative braking to recharge it whenever possible. For example, going up the mountain, I used the electric motor most of the way and then just recharged it coming down the mountain again. But I managed to actually get, for what was a fairly big car, a fairly remarkable 62 mpg, UK mpg, by the way. I did convert it for the entire trip. Now, that's about 10% better than my 600cc motorcycle could manage. So I've been somewhat surprised that motorcycle manufacturers, aside from Honda and Piaggio, who've demonstrated a pair of scooters, I've actually been slow to pick up on hybrid technology. Now, one reason that's often given for this lack of innovation is the usual excuse that given for excluding motorcycles from green roads initiatives, that motorcycles are already more fuel efficient than cars. Well, it's only true if you look at motorcycles under about 300cc. So it's only true if you actually look at the pool of bikes in terms of numbers. Yes, smaller motorcycles do make up the bulk of powered two-wheelers on our roads, but the point is that bigger machines often struggle to match the fuel consumption figures for small cars, and sometimes not even so small cars either. I still remember doing a fairly rapid drive to Oxford along the motorway, 2.5-litre diesel hire car, big lump of an estate, and the car actually averaged 55 mpg over the entire journey. Okay, now diesels have gone out of fashion since then, but that's exactly the same as my XJ6 would average for the same journey. And I probably was a lot more comfortable, frankly, in the car. Anyway, the other point to say is that motorcycles over 300cc's are rarely used as utilitarian transport. Some people do buy bigger bikes simply to get backwards and forwards to work, but most of us don't. Most of us use them for a mix, maybe some commuting, but mostly recreation for bigger bikes. So whilst achieving a reduction in fuel consumption isn't seen as a selling point, it's not because the motorcycles are actually economical to run. They're simply not. So how about a pair of slightly more rational questions? Where would you put the electric motor and battery in a conventional motorcycle? And wouldn't it add significantly to the bike's weight? Well, one answer to that is to actually use a somewhat smaller internal combustion engine. Now, I'll have a quick look at this. That's a stripped off hybrid motorcycle. It's a Kawasaki. The engine is the parallel twin. It's a bit difficult to see where it's come from, but it's probably either the 250 or much more likely the 400 Ninja. The engines are similar sizes, but obviously the 400 is much more powerful, puts out about 44 horsepower. Now, the electric motor, if you look closely, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit, is perched there over the top of the gearbox. You can just make out some finning there on top of the conventional gearbox. The battery itself appears to be that black box which is slung under the seat just above the swing arm. So the thing is that when you actually put the clothing back onto the bike, you barely actually see if I can get the picture to change, just a minute, come on, do what I want you to do. No, it's not changing for some reason. Let me try it another way. Oh dear, right, I don't know why this is not working. Let's get, there we are, we finally got there. Okay, so that is the hybrid motorcycle with its clothes on, and you can barely see the electricery, which makes it a hybrid. Okay, so the report suggests the motors are actually linked via the semi-automatic transmission. I think it's probably the same 6-speed one that was on the pure electric Kawasaki that I've shown previously. And the electric motor is able to run forwards, obviously, as to drive the machine, but it can also run backwards and act as a generator to charge the battery. The frame appears to be a modified version of the 400 Ninja frame. It's constructed, obviously, from tubular steel, which makes it relatively easy to modify. And I think the dual motor concept on a bike like this actually makes a lot of sense. Like the trip in the Aldi that I took, you'd use the petrol engine for longer runs, and you'd use the regenerative braking and the direct charging to ensure the battery is fully charged for those moments when you want to make short trips into urban areas, and specifically to emission-free zones. But I hear you say a 400 would be too slow out on the open road. Well, okay, you're not going to be riding two up at 120 plus on a 400, but the fact is that surprisingly little power is actually required to maintain a decent cruising speed. One of my favorite factoids is that you actually only use about 10 horsepower to push a bike along at a sustained 60 miles per hour on the flat. So 44 horsepower is more than enough, way more than enough to sustain 100 miles per hour. So what takes the power, or more correctly, torque, for acceleration? And the answer is it's accelerating rapidly. That's what needs torque. And this is where the electric motor comes in, because the advantage of the dual engine configuration is that the electric motor doesn't have to be used just on its own. It can be used to give a torque boost to the petrol engine when we need more power for a rapid takeoff, or for acceleration when overtaking, for example. So the combined effect of the two motors working together would be that of a much bigger ICE. But there are some pluses. By running the smaller motor at higher revs, where it's operating more efficiently in a cruise mode, it's going to use less fuel than a much bigger engine, which is way out of its fuel efficiency zone, trundling along at low revs and simply basically burning fuel for no good reason. That's why big engines generally use more fuel to travel at the same speed than a smaller bike. It's not simply because the bigger bike is heavier or more less aerodynamic. It's simply that the engine is not so fuel efficient. So we should be able to use the combination of the two motors to get some good fuel economy, particularly if we're recovering energy via regenerative braking rather than hammering the brakes on hard everywhere. So the question remains, would anybody actually want to ride a hybrid rather than a fully electric bike or a full petrol bike? It's hard to say. Many riders are still very distrusting of electric bikes, partly because they misunderstand things like weight and dimensions. There are still people who think they're heavy and tall. They are not. Many point to the restricted top speeds and say they don't match what they can get on their internal combustion engine bike. Well, you can't, even though the electric motors offer exceptional acceleration. They don't have the high top speeds, but how often do you use those high speeds? So personally, I suspect that initially, at least, the concept of a hybrid will be difficult to sell to those riders, simply because they will confuse the small capacity of the internal combustion engine with limited performance. I think those riders will simply not want to believe that the electric motor can actually deliver real-world performance. Anyway, there we go. That's that story for you. Don't forget, if you enjoy the show, you can head over to my Ko-fi page and you can become a supporter or a subscriber over there. You can open up lots of specialist better biking articles, and also if you become a supporter, regular supporter, you get access to some self-help training articles over there as well. So do pop over, have a look, plenty of free stuff to read, find out what's on offer. Nick has also looked in this morning. Good to see you there, Nick. Right, okay, so let's go back to that first story, the National Motorcyclists Council talking about what they think our rider and training and testing regime should be post-Brexit. Well, the first thing to say is that they point out that the third driving licence directive ceased to exist in the UK on January the 31st, 2021, thanks to us leaving the EU, and that although UK licensing law remains aligned to European law, they say there's now an opportunity to review and revise the regulations to better suit UK circumstances under the framework set by the 1968 Vienna Convention on Road Traffic, to which they point out the EU is also a signatory. Now, I'll just remind you that their position on this is saying that training and testing should make motorcycling safer. So I'm going to run through their proposals and actually ask if that's likely to be achieved. Now, the proposals are as follows. 1, improved CBT syllabus, theory and hazard perception test to be taken and passed before CBT. Can't disagree with that at all. There's absolutely no excuse for not having done a theory and hazard test before you go out on the road, full stop. It should be mandatory for anybody undertaking driving lessons in cars too, not something that is tacked on towards the end of a course of driver training just to get the certificate to go to the test. So yes, get the theory test sorted out before you do CBT, and then improve CBT. CBT is over 30 years old and hasn't significantly changed, although I had a bit of an argument with another instructor about that recently. Cow steering is still not formally covered. So we teach you to go, we teach you to stop, we simply don't teach you what you do between those 2 points. Point number 2, licensing needs incentivization via training upgrades from a lower to a higher category rather than repeat testing to move between license categories on the progressive licensing route. Now, I don't disagree with that either, but that's not actually the fault of the third driving license directive, as the press release actually implies, because the directive, as I have explained many times, allowed for each step of progressive access to be achieved via training rather than testing. It's the same provision that's allowed the DFT to move some manoeuvring elements of the HGV test out to training schools to be signed off by approved trainers, and therefore allow more tests to be conducted to get our numbers of HGV drivers up again. It's always been a possibility under the EU rules that training schools could run sort of the approval for the tiered licensing on site rather than having it all done via a test. It was the DFT and the DVSA that went for testing. So would this make riding safer? Well, as you do the training to get to the standard required for each test, it's hard to say. I doubt that it would make any significant distance. Now, third point, each licensing step should also allow access to machines up to the minimum test vehicle specification for the next category of license to be ridden on L plates. This should also apply to those who gain full moped licenses age 16. Well, first point is that the number of people who actually get a moped license at 16 is minuscule. Okay, you may find a few would take the moped test just to get onto 125, but essentially I think this seems complicated to me and unnecessary. If you pass your A2 test, which gives you access to an intermediate bike up to 35 kilowatts or 47 horsepower, the benefit would actually be to move up to a 50 kilowatt or 67.05 brake horsepower bike. Is that actually necessary? You'd be riding that on L plates. I think it just makes more complication in a system that we're trying to make simpler. They then argue, point 4, a return to a single event test rather than the current two-part format. Well, I don't disagree with that. And it could easily be achieved by moving the current off-road motorcycle maneuvers out of the test altogether, away from the module 1 part of the test, and to allow them to be assessed by trainers. Trying to get those maneuvers done on road is not a non-starter. The whole point of the motorcycle maneuvering areas was that with increased congestion on the roads, it was becoming more and more difficult to perform the sort of things like the U-turn and the emergency stops safely on road. That's why the motorcycle maneuvering centres were built, and that's why the test took them off-road. The fact that it was made two-part made life more complicated, but yeah, we could simply do that by getting the trainers to do this. There have been government objections to this, but in fact CBT trainers make exactly the same competency decisions when deciding if a rider is fit to ride on the road on L plates. Next, point 5, abolition of the A2 license, passing test for A1 to grant access to an A license. Now, as it said, however, as per the second driving license directive, this license would be restricted gaining access to the current A2 specification of machine. The license to be lifted, restriction rather, to be lifted once riders complete a compulsory skills training course available 1 year after the test is passed. Right, so basically this is going back to the old direct access system, the original direct access system, where you could take your test on the big bike. Generally speaking, it was something like a CB 500, GS 500 or ER5, and then get a full unrestricted license at the age 21. But if you were under 21, you could take your test on a 125 and then get a license for what at the time was a 33 horsepower, 25 kilowatt motorcycle. The trouble was there weren't many around, so they had to be restricted from other bikes. But anyway, this step would basically move the restriction up to 35 kilowatts, 47 horsepower, and that brings in bikes like the 390 Duke, the CB 500 range, or even the new GSX 950, which I talked about a few days ago, which can legally be restricted to 35 kilowatts. Now, my training experience bridged the changing rules from all the training done on a 125 and getting a full license on a 125 to the introduction of direct access in 1997. And what I have to say is that one of the problems that I found with training people on 125 is that you could jump on anything you liked. I remember one guy actually had his GSXR 1100 delivered to the training school, ready for him to ride away after he'd passed his test. But the learning on 125 doesn't equip people to ride those bigger machines. Many even struggle with a 33 horsepower restricted bike, something like a 600 Bandit. It was quite weighty and quite a sizable bike. Just because it only put out 33 horsepower didn't make it difficult to read. And quite frankly, if you're going to jump on a GSX 950 because it's legitimately restricted to 35 kilowatts, I think you're going to find that bike a handful. It's not just the power, it's the things like the added responsiveness of brakes and throttle. It's the dimensions of the machine, the length, the turning circle, the physical mass of the bike, and the seat height. To my mind, the benefit of direct access training was pretty clear. We had to train riders to a higher standard to manage those bigger machines that was used for direct access. And that meant the riders were actually better equipped to move up to their next level of chosen machine that they bought after passing their test. So I don't believe that would actually make riding safer. Next one, point 6, direct access minimum age to return to 21 years old. Well, is that going to be safer? I don't know. I'd like to see some positive evidence, first of all, that the current restriction to 25 years of age to access to bigger machines has not had a positive benefit. I don't know whether it has or not. I haven't seen any evidence. I'm personally doubtful it's made much of a difference, but let's find out. Let's give us some data on that one. Point 7, access to post-test training also needs further incentivization. Well, my comment on that is simply it's a minefield in itself. Who is suitable, who's offering training, who is approved, who is likely to offer the best training? Does it have to be an approved trainer? Number 8, minimum license test vehicle specification for electric motorcycles needs to be redefined for each licensing category. Well, possibly. There do seem to be some performance anomalies for electric bikes that allow seemingly quite powerful electric bikes to be ridden on oil plates. Point 9, all changes to licensing to maintain alignment with the Vienna Convention maintain high overall standards to ensure the continued exchangeability of licenses for those moving away from the UK. Well, I don't know. I would have thought if we'd simply maintain standards and align with the EU, it will be easier than with the Vienna Convention. I'm not entirely au fait with exactly how it works, but anyway, hey ho. NMC's Executive Director Craig Carey-Clinch, he said, now that the UK has left the EU, there is an opportunity to create a system that's easier for novices to understand, less bureaucratic, provides greater reward for passing the test on smaller bikes while retaining high standards and providing a boost for the motorcycle training sector. Well, quite frankly, having read the proposals, I remain to be persuaded that this actually achieves any benefit that can't be achieved within the existing framework of the third license directive, or that it's any less complex. The only real plus I can see is moving some elements of the bike test back onto towards the training schools, and that remains that option within the third driving license directive. The really big issue that it doesn't seem to address is who's crashing, and the answer to that seems to be, as usual, it's inexperienced riders who are often riding on provisional licenses on low-powered machines in urban areas, and more experienced riders who are on higher powered machines in rural roads. Now, tweaking the licensing rules is not addressing the second problem, and that's for sure. And I'd say that changing the rules on tests won't likely address much of the first issue either. It's hard to say how many of the KSI figures feature delivery riders working on L plates. And my guess is that most of those would have no intention of spending money taking a bike test. And it's also difficult to say how many involve young riders who are actually setting out on the bottom rung of their biking ladder and would move up given the opportunity. So my thoughts would actually be these. If you want to make riding safer and reduce crash numbers, then make the professional learners in the delivery industry take a test and get qualified. At least they will have more skills at the end of that. And if they don't, then they ban them for working for reward. Then it's all about getting 17-year-old riders who are currently spending years on L plates on 125s to get to a higher standard immediately. We don't want to wait till they're 21 and can take an A2 test. We actually want them to get trained at the age of 17 when they first emerge onto the road. Now, that could be achieved by significantly upgrading CBT, and which of course would also address the 16-year-olds who ride mopeds. And my thinking that has always been that CBT should be a minimum of a 2-day course, with the second day spent mostly on the road gaining genuine road riding experience. Remember, this age group have very, very little time on the road. Most of them won't even have ridden bicycles. And you can incentivize binning the L plates by opening up access to a bigger machine straight away on passing a test on the 125. But as I already mentioned, this is a tricky compromise. You end up with a rider who trained on the 125 actually on a physically bigger machine for which they're essentially unprepared. So my suggestion would be, if you're going to do this, that the test pass allows them to ride their 125 minus an L plate, or take a further training course straight away to validate their license for the bigger machine when they choose to ride it, not to get onto that bigger bike straight away. That would improve their skills. It would familiarize themselves with the sort of bike that they will be riding as soon as they have passed their test, if there is that extra training course available and ready to use before they jump on the bigger bike. Then, and I would say 2 years is a perfectly reasonable time to ride on a middling sized motorcycle. In line with current EU regs, they can graduate to an unrestricted machine, but after a further training course. So you put the emphasis back onto training and not testing, but you do it in a way where the training is delivered at the point in time at which it is most beneficial to those riders. Right, okay, I've actually overrun, so I'm going to have to leave the heated clothing element until next week, because I do need to get out, otherwise it will be a very, very long show today. I really hadn't realized quite how long it was all going to take today, so many apologies for that. We'll come back to heated clothing next week. If you're looking forward to that, do drop in on Wednesday when I will cover it instead. One final thing to say today: don't forget the next live webcast will be on the Wednesday, 3rd of November. It'll be called Breaking the Circle, and basically what we'll consider is whether or not we should be braking in bends. Is it an avoid at all cost maneuver or an essential skill? In theory, I would say that we should enter every corner at a speed that allows us to stop in the distance we can see is clear, etc., etc. In reality, the situation ahead of us can change in an instant, and we're human, we make mistakes. So the ability to lose speed rapidly under control in a corner, I would say, is an essential skill, but not every rider manages it. Far too many riders actually do come a cropper braking corners. So we'll have a look at how you can gain those skills and how you can practice them. So from the author of the Science of Being Seen presentation, this webcast looks at braking and steering inputs and how they work together without overwhelming tire grip. So that's the wrong bit of text. Let's get the link in for you. If you want to sign up for that, it's £5 to attend that particular webinar, and here is the booking link. Tickets will go out approximately 24 hours before the show. Right, okay, that is it. We have done it all today. Couple of comments here. James has said his own rule for my kids is they can learn to ride a bike, but not until they've learned to drive. I have to say it's how I did it, and I think it was a benefit to me. Clive says another great session. Thanks, Clive. So, all right, that's it from me today. Thank you for looking into my Elevenses webcast. I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training, and I'll be back on Wednesday at 11 with the next show, which will include the heated clothing discussion.